This story began in a majestic castle over which the sun shone brightly. Nothing foreshadowed trouble, but suddenly a sharp cry was heard throughout the territory, which almost brought all the servants to their ears. This exclamation belonged to a young girl who, gesticulating strongly, tried to get at least some explanation about her father's decision to marry her off. She was very indignant, but it had little effect. The man was adamant and did not want to hear any objections from his daughter, assuring that such an offer could not be made, because they would definitely not be able to find a better candidate. She wanted to say something to that, but kept silent, understanding that no amount of persuasion will convince her father. But the girl could not understand how such an important decision was made only through a letter. He exhaled heavily, because he did not understand why his daughter was so against this wedding, because he was sure that he was doing it for the sake of his child and for her future. She didn't answer that. However, in a moment she couldn't stand it and slammed her hand hard on the table, because she didn't understand why her father chose Ruggieri out of all the options Lanto. Most of all, it was this decision that angered the young girl. She sat in her room, and the anger still did not want to pass. There were many books lying around, and an assistant was sitting behind her, quietly embroidering something, despite her mistress's disgruntled monologue. Farm did not understand why the girl was so indignant, because the wedding was quite a logical action, but it made Aeta even more angry, so she decided to remind her why she could not marry that person. The assistant gave up, because she remembered the reason. But this did not calm the young lady, because no matter how she convinced her father, he wasn't going to reverse his decision and told her to at least give him a chance. She was sure that this marriage was only for the sake of establishing ties between families and not for her happiness. These words were uttered with great sadness, and she did not hide her feelings. The girl understood that such a marriage could bring peace and prosperity, but all this was only for a certain time, because not everything was subject to the marriage contract. That is why she has been practicing magic for some time. Faret listened attentively to her mistress without interrupting. When she finished, she turned to the assistant because she could use fairy magic. The girl didn't answer anything, just silently looked back. The assistant exhaled. She understood everything, but still asked her mistress to at least think and try to give the boy a chance, which she resented because she was firmly convinced of her decision. Aeta was always considered the pride of Sola, who stood out for her unusual beauty and high intelligence. Despite everything, the girl hated Marquis Lanto with all her soul. It seemed it was built into her. Despite everything, the girl did not stop conducting secret research. She tried to find some data that happened before the current era of the church, or rather 300 years ago, based on one hypothesis. Her efforts were not in vain, and the girl was able to prove that magic and fairies also existed in the world. With this, she published an entire book devoted to this hypothesis and its evidence, but under a pseudonym. However, critics did not appreciate all the efforts of the girl, which upset her quite a bit. But the most important of those who stood on the path of truth was Ruggieri himself, Lanto, which was the beginning of her hatred for him. In front of more than 100 different researchers, the boy severely criticized and humiliated Aeta's work. He argued that all the evidence in the book was complete nonsense on the level of fiction. Then everyone believed. Farm took a basket of dirty laundry to take to the laundry. She stopped for a moment and looked in the direction of her mistress, who was sitting in despair. She felt sorry for the girl for her efforts. But the assistant understood that her lady was upset not by the fact that her efforts were not accepted, but by the criticism itself. Everyone was sure that magic did not exist, so this fact could not help but upset the young girl. Magichka stopped for a moment and decided to support her mistress. She approached the girl and asked if everything was okay with her. At this question, Aeta grabbed her hand and asked for help. She was asked to go on a blind date, to which the assistant was very surprised, because this meeting was supposed to almost solve the issue of the whole country. The girl tried to convince the lady and calm her down. However, she assured that everything was fine with her and she was speaking completely seriously. Farma just sighed, because she was not sure why her mistress was behaving like that. She thought that the reason was dismissal. However, she was assured that everything was not like that, because the magician was her best friend. Nevertheless, the girl still did not understand why the hostess asked her to take such a step, because they are not alike. Aeta finally let go of her hand and lowered her head, because she understood that her friend was right, but despite everything, she really didn't want this marriage. She had nothing to answer to this truth that stung her ears. The assistant was sure that such a lie would be exposed immediately, but the lady only grabbed her by the shoulders and pulled her to the mirror to convince her that everything would be fine. Faret didn't even have time to say anything against it. The girl went to the wardrobe to pick up special clothes for her friend, and assured that at such rates even her own father would not be able to distinguish between them. But the silence of the magician stopped, and she looked around. The expression on the assistant's face clearly said that she did not agree with the idea, even though Aeta promised to take all the responsibility on herself, but the desire to help was higher, so she thought about it. The girl calmed down and turned to the window with a sad look, because she understood that she could not force her friend. Faret began to feel guilty, although she understood that if she was exposed, she would be fired. She thought even harder, because she definitely did not want to leave this place. She was fine here, but because of her long acquaintance with the lady, she was even more eager to help, so she agreed after calling the young girl. Above Lanto Castle. The full moon was shining on Fiammolo. It seemed that nothing could disturb the silence of the night, but inside the castle there were strange movements. Inside, they were looking for Ruggiero, who was trying to hide. His father came to the boy's room trying to talk to him. Like Aeta, the young man did not like the idea of marriage, so he tried his best to protest it, but his father was also adamant. He locked himself in his room, not letting anyone outside the door, and firmly decided to follow this path until his father reversed his decision. However, the man did not understand such opposition from his son. The man only wanted Ruggiero to accept this offer and take over the management of the castle, assuming the position of duke at the same time, but the boy was not interested in this at all, so he even threatened to commit suicide. The father was also not happy with such childish actions of his son, so he ordered the guards to bring something heavy so that the man could eventually teach his son and put him in his place. I did not want to cancel the plan. After some time, everyone finally calmed down. The young man sat quietly on his bed, as if after a heavy battle. In fact, it happened somewhere, because despite his hopes, the door was almost broken, leaving a hole there. In a moment, a messenger came to him and stretched out his hand through the hole, begging forgiveness for the intrusion and delivering a letter from the Duke. The guy got up and, having received the package, hurried to read. The letter proved that none of the young man's protests had yielded results, and that his meeting with the Sol family was soon to come. After reading this, he crumpled up the paper and decided to solve everything himself. Having already come up with a cunning plan, he hastened to call one of the servants to his chambers and ordered to bring Angelo. The servant immediately came to the call and wanted to enter, but the door was closed. When he finally came in, he didn't dare say a word without permission. In the end, Ruggiero told the servant that he had an important task for him. He hurried to listen to him, but the lord was silent for a moment. He examined Angelo from head to toe and noticed that he was wearing almost some rags, and the appearance of the servant could not be better. Doubts gripped him, because he was not sure that the plan would work. The boy exhaled heavily. He had no choice, so he confronted the servant with the fact that in 2 weeks he would go to the Sollet family for a friendly meeting. This confused the young man, because he did not understand why. Ruggiero hastened to explain that he would therefore have to meet with Lady Sollet on his behalf. This confused Angelo even more, because he did not understand the reason for this proposal and why he was the one who fell for it. Nevertheless, he also could not say anything against it, so he obeyed the order, but he was warned that this conversation should remain only between them, because if the Duke finds out about it, he will punish him. The servant thought about it even more, because he understood that if he was caught lying, the punishment for him could be serious, so he wanted to refuse, but he was not allowed to do it. Of course, no one wanted to force him, but Ruggiero made it clear that refusal could also be costly in the future. Poor Angelo had no choice but to finally agree. 2 weeks passed imperceptibly and very quickly. The sun was shining brightly outside, so the day of the meeting promised to be quite pleasant. Faret was already properly dressed and waiting for her companion. Her outfit was as closed as possible, so only her face was visible. The girl hoped that she would not be exposed after all. Despite that, she was still very worried, and the guest was still in no hurry to appear. However, She honestly admitted to herself that she would not really want the boy to come. Loaded with unhappy thoughts, she began to stir the poured tea, but the spoon fell out of her hands. It was not luck. In the end, Angelo made it to the castle of the Sollet family. He looked around and was surprised at such luxury, because the palace was quite large. Ruggiero saw to it that his servant was dressed accordingly. No one met him, so he did not know the way. At random, he began to look for the lady and came across a beautiful gazebo, but he did not immediately notice that someone was there. Only a piece of red cloth was visible from under the table. The young man hurried to get closer to inquire what was happening there. Farm heard someone's steps there and wanted to get up quickly, but for a moment she forgot that she was under the table trying to get a spoon. The girl hit her head hard, trying to get up. She began to scold herself for being imprudent, because she believed that she had been embarrassed at the very first meeting, but she tried to quickly put herself in order. The girl pretended as much as possible as if nothing had happened, and Angelo himself did not pay much attention to it. He only bowed slowly and politely to her and asked to join her for tea. The meeting ended, and the sorceress hurried back to the palace and reported everything to her mistress. The corridors in the castle were huge, covered with exquisite carpets. The girl quietly passed the illuminated square. Farm reached her friend's room and opened the door. It was empty inside, so she called to Erzet and she immediately appeared before her. She wanted to know how the meeting went and started asking questions. The assistant was in no hurry to answer, freeing herself from the heavy clothes. Taking off her headdress, she only briefly answered that it was all terrible for her. In a moment she began to tell in more detail. When the girl allowed, as she thought, Ruggiero to join her tea party, silence reigned at the table. The atmosphere turned out to be very unusual, and the witch didn't even know where to start the conversation. The awkward situation didn't seem to make any impression on her partner. He just sat and drank tea as if nothing had happened. She wanted the boy to take at least one step first. Realizing that she would not get anything from her companion now, she began to quietly drink tea while carefully examining the boy. It was difficult for the girl to believe that the same Marquis was in front of her. She paid attention to his appearance, especially his clothes and hairstyle, so she almost immediately concluded that despite his high intelligence, this man did not look like an aristocrat at all. It was angry. Magichka did not understand how it was possible to come to a meeting with Mrs. Erzeta in such a state, but remained silent. The girl hastened to take her words back and realized that she did not like the young man at all. In a moment, the pseudo-Ruggiero still raised his voice and praised the taste of the tea, but she thought it was sarcasm, because for her the tea was quite bitter, but she did not say anything in her voice. That was the end of the conversation. Both of them sat in silence for some time, so after finishing the tea, the young man got up and hurriedly bowed, announcing that it was already time for him to go, at which Farme was very surprised, because she did not understand such behavior. She wanted to say something, but she couldn't say a word because of the shock. She just looked at the boy in silence and didn't understand at all how she could see herself in relation to Mrs. Erzeta. She knew perfectly well all the rules of etiquette and saw that the Marquis did not follow any of these rules. The very minimum that he should do when saying goodbye to the lady is to kiss her hand. It was not a joke that angered the magician. She believed that the boy was very lucky that she was in front of him, because she was sure that Erzeta definitely did not forgive such rude behavior. Farm stood up sharply. After listening to her friend to the end, the lady could not understand why and was very angry and indignant, because it was obvious that the boy did not understand anything. Magichka wanted to continue, but decided to change clothes. It was difficult for her to free herself from this dress, so she was helped. While her friend helped her to get rid of her clothes, the girl continued. In her opinion, despite his status, the Marquis was impolite. Erzeta helped the mage put her hair in order for a while and continued to describe the Marquis, whom she would hardly recognize if it weren't for his clothes, because everything else about the boy was in absolute disarray. Nevertheless, regardless of these obvious flaws, Farme was sure that the boy did not want this marriage as much as her lady, so she hastened to assure him of this. The friend thanked her for everything. The lady decided not to bother her assistant any more today, so as a sign of gratitude, she allowed the girl to rest and sleep well. This could not but please the friend, so she did not hide her joy. The next day, the girl decided to use her day off to visit her home. Holding a basket full of guests in her hands, she almost ran home with a smile on her face. It was quiet, but cozy at home. The only one inside was her brother Ronjo. The girl hastened to ask him what he was doing and, in general, how things were going while she was gone. The boy was mute, but this made him seem even smarter. He gestured to his sister that he had spent the whole day reading a book. The girl was glad to hear this, so she hurried to praise her brother. Broddick returned to reading the book again, and suddenly, memories from the past came to her. Although the boy was her brother, they were similar only in eyes, but this did not diminish her love at all. She remembered the times when, as a minor, she worked hard in the market for survival. There was not enough money, and even persuasion to add a little did not bring results. There was not enough money even for food, but these futile requests only annoyed the employer more because he did not understand why the girl cared so much about her half-brother. It was difficult to explain to her. Realizing that she would get nothing more from her husband, she bowed her head and went home, bypassing the counters. And although she and her brother had different mothers, the girl did not stop loving him because of this. On this day, she overheard a conversation between two women, so she listened in passing. The women were talking about fairies and magic and how one lady promised a reward if someone told her about it. They joked among themselves that they wouldn't mind getting a bag of gold for performing magic, but they couldn't. Pharma listened to them carefully, because for her such a reward was very valuable. For a moment, she wanted to run to the palace right now and show her abilities, but stopped because there were no guarantees that all this was true. In addition, there was a threat that she would be executed for magic. She understood that she now had a rather difficult choice to make, because on the one hand she had a younger brother who did not eat much, and on the other her own life. The girl understood that she could not die. Pharma knew that her brother's life would also end quickly if she died, but she could no longer look at the boy's tired face. Magichka understood that she had to do something, otherwise both were in danger. Driving away evil thoughts, the girl finally decided not to delay and go to the palace, where, according to rumors, she could receive a reward. With this money, she could buy delicious food and clothes. When she entered the palace, she was immediately met by a lady. The girl stood behind, taking her time to approach, although the lady did not show an evil character. In the end, she was invited to sit down, and she did not hesitate. Different people had come to talk about magic to the lady, and she had never had children before, so she didn't expect to hear anything grand, but she certainly didn't expect a girl to say that she could use magic. It was difficult for her to believe this, and she even thought that the child was rather deceiving her. There was silence in the office, and Farme hid her face, because she thought that she would be ordered to be executed sooner than believed. Nevertheless, she still hoped that her words would be accepted as truth, but in vain. After a short silence, the lady just laughed, but in a minute her gaze became angry and almost icy. The lady threatened the girl not to dare to deceive her for money, because she was far from the first to do so. Magichka clenched her fists tighter and asked Erzeta to at least give her the opportunity to prove herself. But she just exhaled tiredly. But in the end she allowed the child to try, but it was still difficult for her to believe it. And although the lady herself did not notice, strange transparent balls were circling around her. The girl tried to calm down and concentrate. She was somewhat frightened by the sudden change in the lady's emotions, because now she did not smile at her with a warm smile, but instead looked at her with a cold look. Farm focused her magic on her hand and quietly ordered the wind around and some objects to move. In a moment, an invisible force listened to her, and the book that was lying next to the lady flew up. The magic lasted only a few minutes, but it was enough to cause quite a few emotions in Milady, although she did not show them immediately, but only after a certain time after the wind subsided. Erzeta could not believe that all this was happening because she assured that the windows were closed. The girl immediately began to explain that she made these balls move, but they are visible only to her. The lady did not want to stop there, so she asked the girl if she could cast another spell. Magichka fainted a little, but confirmed that she still had some abilities. She was asked to demonstrate. The girl was embarrassed, but she did not dare to refuse. So with the help of the same invisible balls, she was able to enchant abilities with all the elements. Milady was quite enthusiastic, because this was exactly what she was looking for. When Farm finished demonstrating her skills, the lady immediately stood up without saying a word and walked over to a bookshelf completely filled with books. Hearing about the invisible balls, she remembered something. Having found the right book, she began to read carefully and realized that the balls of light that the girl sees were actually not just pieces of light, but what constituted nature itself. Manipulation with such balls was called fairy magic. It was this that confirmed the hypothesis that the lady relied on in the course of her research. She understood that in the end her efforts would not be in vain. Aeta understood that she needed this girl very much, so she had to keep her in any way she could, but she did not know how to do it. Faret, meanwhile, sat silently on the chair and waited for the lady's decision. 5 years have passed since that time. Guests began to arrive at the castle of the Faret family, and the lady herself was preparing for the reception. The girl was helping her mistress to put herself in order and do her hair. Magichka was somewhat indignant that such beauty of her lady had to be hidden, at which the girl herself laughed. But the veil was necessary because she could accidentally come across the Marquise of Levanto. Milady gave her friend the day off while she herself was at the reception, and hoped that Faret would be able to rest. But for the assistant herself, this day was by no means a rest. In fact, she was even more tired. Although she was already lying in bed, because it was already quite late, someone on the street did not stop calling her, so she had no choice but to go outside. A familiar girl was waiting for her on the street. Leah excitedly reported that today they had quite a celebration, because His Majesty had promised to share the dishes from the table, so she hoped that Faret would also join in the celebration. The offer sounded tempting, but today she planned to rest at home. Hearing his sister's conversation, Ranjo also went out to look at the late guest. The boy also wanted his sister to have fun. Her brother even brought her a dress. Leah saw an unusual fabric and drew attention to the fact that it was Lady Erzada's dress. The girl hastened to tell that it was a present for her birthday. The acquaintance was very surprised that Faret did not want to attend the party even with such a chic outfit, so the magician finally gave up and agreed to come, chasing away the old acquaintance instead. When the door finally closed, she breathed a sigh of relief. The girl understood that she had made a promise, but still thought about the proposal, but in the end decided to go to the party and play something on the lute. After some time, she got herself together, taking a musical instrument with her. The girl reached the palace, but stopped in front of the gate to the garden. The magician knew that the entrance here was forbidden for servants. However, she understood that it would take too long to make a detour, so she decided to take advantage of the moment when no one was in sight and quickly run through the garden. But unexpectedly, she ran into someone. Her leg gave her up for a moment, and the girl almost fell to the floor, but the stranger managed to pick her up in time. The guy immediately asked if everything was okay with her, but she was speechless. He continued to bombard her with questions, but she did not answer any of them. When she regained consciousness, she quickly released herself from his embrace and stepped back a little, asking instead for his identity. The stranger eventually introduced himself as the Marquis himself, Ruggiero Levanto, with whom they were having tea yesterday. The girl could not believe it, because her memories of him were completely different. He reminded her that they had seen each other yesterday, and it frightened her, because she thought that the Marquis recognized her as yesterday's Lady Erzada. However, in a moment, when the young man continued, the girl realized that everything was wrong. Angelo told her that he noticed her at the ceremony, but he didn't have time to come over to say hello, because she left the place very quickly. He was glad that he could meet her in this kindergarten. Faret did not interrupt and gave the opportunity to speak. The guy picked up her tool and gave it to the owner, and then bowed his head and apologized for yesterday's behavior, but she didn't understand why. He noticed that these apologies did not bring results at all, rather they pushed him away a little. The young man came a little closer to her, which made her take several steps away, confessing his sympathy for her. Such renunciations almost disarmed the girl. She could not understand such a sudden change in the Marquise's behavior, so she continued to stare at him in a daze, unable to answer anything. The boy wanted to correct his yesterday's mistakes in etiquette, so he asked for her hand and permission to kiss, to which she, without objection, like a doll, offered her palm, and the Marquis gently kissed her temple. After this action, he hastened to bow and turned and went to the party, leaving the girl alone. She stared at him for some time, not being able to move, clutching the lute tighter. Even at the party, the girl could not come to her senses. The words of the Marquise were deeply stuck in her head, and although a melody sounded from the lute and everyone around had fun, various thoughts tore her apart from the inside. After playing the tunes, She decided to rest a little. Taking a glass of wine, she sat down in a corner away from human eyes. She was somewhat outraged by the Marquis's confession. It was not pretty for her. She saw how the groom and the weaver, whose love was already known almost to the whole world, danced to the romantic melody of the instruments. Suddenly, instead of lovers, she and the Marquis appeared in her imagination. The girl quickly cut off these thoughts about the Marquis. Meanwhile, the boy himself moved as far away from the party as possible, wanting to be alone a little. He looked out the open window, looking at the sky. A cool breeze covered him from head to toe. The young man understood that tomorrow it would be time to return home. The first meeting with Lady Aeta was completed, although the acquaintance itself was delayed a little. He remembered the moment when, while still in the castle of his masters, their conversation with the young lord was interrupted by the Viscount. The man desperately wanted to talk to the young man, but he was not alone. When the man's voice became quite audible, the boys realized that he was close. The servant, meanwhile, was in full milord's attire, so it was necessary to hide him so that their game would not be exposed. Ruggiero managed to hide the servant just in time, because in a moment, Viscount Moretti entered the room. The guy was already sitting at the table, and although the young man still did not give permission to enter, this did not stop the man. They joked about the moment, and the young man eventually invited the Viscount to sit down, which he did. There was silence in the room for a moment, which was broken by the man asking how the meeting with Aeta went. The boy panicked a bit, but immediately tried to pretend that everything was fine. At the same time, the man also behaved freely, but noted that he noticed a change in the boy's clothes. Ruggiero did not understand what he meant, and the Viscount told him that he had seen him in the corridor in completely different clothes, and why there was very little to change before he came to his rooms. The young man still pretended that he did not understand what was being said, but for Moretti, these games began to get boring, and he already told in a direct text that he knew about the plan of the boy to send a servant to meet. The young man clenched his hand into a fist. He wondered why the Viscount did not tell his father if he knew about his actions. The man just leaned back in his chair, but avoided answering. Instead, he insisted on marriage. At the same time, he also threatened the boy that if he refused, the Duke would definitely find out about everything. These words greatly angered Ruggiero, because a certain Viscount dared to threaten him. This futile anger only made Moretti laugh. He did not feel threatened by the boy at all. The man got up from his chair to leave, and once again emphasized marriage. The young man could not understand the reason for this need. He found it interesting that the Duke's private secretary had no other problems than the marriage issue. The Viscount paused and explained that he had personally arrived at the Palace of Sceaux for a secret meeting with the Duke. When the door closed behind the Viscount, Ruggiero allowed Angelo. He got out from under the bed and went to the table. The servant fulfilled the request of his master, so he would like to receive the reward as agreed. Milord clutched his head after all the events. The last thing he wanted was to be bothered now, but the promise had been made, so he decided to listen to the servant, thinking he would ask for money. The boy remained silent for a while, but in a moment he asked to be made a free man. This quite surprised the young man. Opening his eyes wide, he seemed to demand an explanation, and the servant told everything. As it turned out, Angelo belonged to the Lanto family. He was forbidden to leave the grounds of the castle or find another job without permission. That is why the only desire of the servant was to be freed from serfdom. Ruggiero thought about it, because he was sure that he was a hired servant. He had never heard of this boy being a member of his family, so he began to wonder who he was. Be that as it may, he could not fulfill this request so easily, because he was far from the main person. Angelo informed about this, which upset him quite a bit, but he did not want to lose hope. The host exhaled, because he remembered that he promised to fulfill any request, but he could not do that. This angered the servant, because no amount of money in the world could buy him freedom. He grabbed Ruggiero. With his mind clouded by anger, the servant did not immediately understand what he was saying, but the boy was immediately pushed away and he fell to the floor, his glasses rolled to the side. Milord abruptly rose from his chair. Looking at the servant, a new idea came to him. The boy remembered that Moretti had talked about divorce, but he was sure that his father would not allow it, but it only concerned him. But this did not concern the Sollet family itself, so the most important thing now was to convince Lady Aeta herself to refuse the marriage. The young man eventually found an ideal way out of the situation. He approached the servant, adjusting his collar. He should definitely be executed for such behavior, but this time he will be forgiven in exchange for one more favor. Milord came even closer to Angelo. The young man crouched down to the servant and ordered him to seduce Lady Aeta to force her to abandon the engagement. Various methods could be used for this. Even rumors were allowed to spread. Since the two already knew each other, it was easier to carry out this plan, but even if they failed, they would not be punished. The servant wanted to say something, but remained silent because he was finally promised freedom. At last, he left the master's room and went on his way. It was hard to believe that this plan came to such an intelligent person as Ruggiero, but for the sake of freedom, he had to do it and become independent. Meanwhile, in the palace of So, Duchess Milena received a letter containing positive news about her first meeting with the Marquis. The woman did not want to delay all this, so she assured her daughter in marriage. Aeta wanted to explain her position, but her mother stopped her. The woman reported that the girl's father was planning a public construction project that would allow them to eventually start trading with the South. The parents wanted to get investment from the Allied nations, but the canal had to pass through a river located in the territory of the county of Levanto. The girl finally understood the reason for the need for marriage. However, the reason was not only in friendly relations between families, but also in her younger sister. She was more fortunate because such a burden did not fall on her. Father wanted the older sister to marry first. Aeta felt a little sad, but she accepted everything. Looking at her daughter, the woman asked to be patient only until the project was completed, after which she personally promised to achieve their divorce. In late spring, Lady Solette and the Marquise of Levanto officially exchanged engagement documents. The girls went to look at the exquisite ring intended for this event, and the lady did not miss a joke. Milady assured her friend that this marriage was concluded only for political gain, and was sure that she and the Marquis would not even see each other until the very end of the divorce. Faret was a little worried. Aeta, on the other hand, was sure that Ruggiero Levanto was absolutely indifferent to her because he even announced the engagement through a letter. Magichka wanted to confess to the Marquis's confession last evening. However, after learning that her friend would no longer see the Marquis, she decided that the situation had turned out for the best. In addition, she believed that such actions of the guy were due to his lack of knowledge about the project. The girl was very satisfied because now she did not have to meet with the Marquis, and her friend did not have to endure this marriage for long. Aeta hurried her magic because Mass was about to start soon. After the prayer, the church immediately became empty. Everyone left, but the girls remained, and the lady approached the priest because she wanted to talk to him, but he had to refuse. As it turned out, one meeting was already scheduled with her teacher, who, according to him, was a very intelligent scientist. Aeta was fascinated by this. She wondered who this person was, whom the teacher himself had recognized. The priest asked if the girl wanted to participate in the meeting, and she immediately agreed. The sun was slowly setting on the street, painting the sky in a bright orange color. The lady waited impatiently. The lady's assistant, meanwhile, sat quietly behind and was again busy with embroidery. Magichka was pleased to notice her friend's good mood, and she was happy because she knew it was important. Milady kept looking out the window, waiting for the scientist. She very much wanted to learn from him and share knowledge, so seeing him at the gate, she asked Fermi to meet him. The girl did not delay, but in the uplifted mood, which was transmitted by her friend, ran to fulfill the request. But when she reached the gate, she stopped for a moment and took a look. The figure was very familiar. Coming a little closer to see the guest, she sobbed in surprise because she had never expected to meet the person whom they were never to see again. Ruggiero himself came. She quickly grabbed herself and quickly ran back to the castle to report the unexpected arrival of the Marquis lady. Farm did not even understand how she ended up in front of the door of the room and quickly opened it. Aeta almost dropped the teapot from which she was already pouring freshly brewed tea. Milady looked at the sorceress with surprise and quickly informed her that the Marquise pretended to be a guest in order to enter the castle. The girl looked around, but did not see Ruggiero anywhere. Then, breathing hard, the friend began to guess that the boy must have already been let inside. It was at this moment that there was a knock on the room. The magician understood that if the Marquis now met with the real Lady Aeta, then their previous deception would definitely be exposed, but it was already too late, because the door to the room opened. The guy went inside and met the girl's displeased look. He quickly apologized for his rudeness, explaining that he did not hear the answer. Meanwhile, the lady herself hid behind the screen. Faret, in a displeased tone, informed the Marquise that even so he had no right to enter her room. Confused, the young man apologized and wanted to leave the room. Magichka did not answer anything. He took her silence as a sign of agreement, so he stayed in the room. A little closer, the young man slightly bowed to her and introduced himself as Elio. The girl looked at him with incomprehension. She crossed her arms, showing that she would not be fooled, because she knew this boy well. For a moment he was glad that he had not been forgotten. Instead, the girl reported that it was theft. Using someone else's name, he illegally entered the palace and she wanted to call the security. But the young man was not afraid and got out of the situation, because he just wanted to meet his future wife. These words struck her like a thunderbolt, and she did not know what to answer. The Marquis reminded her that they had already exchanged rings, but he turned his attention to her hand and noticed that she was not wearing any rings. She quickly replied that she was simply afraid of losing such a valuable gift. Such a question almost drove her into a corner, but she quickly gathered her thoughts and instead began to scold the boy for cheating. He replied that the priest did not know about anything. Nevertheless, the young man did not leave the opportunity to at least somehow please the girl, so he continued to make a good impression on Pharma with sweet renunciations. The girl looked at his hand and noticed that it had the same ring as Lady Aeta's. She retreated from him a couple of steps, which made the young man think that the lady did not like him at all. Magichka had nothing against him, although she did not like his actions at all, because he broke into her room without an invitation. The guy tried to press on her mercy, but she did not give in. She thought she knew the true reason for the Marquis' coming, so she immediately told him not to worry, as she had no intention of breaking off the engagement. The young man immediately understood that they would part ways after all. These words shocked her, because she understood that he had already guessed about everything, but she did not know how he knew about it. She felt sorry for him for a moment, because she saw this sad look, but she did not show her emotions. She quickly turned away from him and finally asked him to leave, because she herself was waiting for the scientist. The guy smiled and offered to talk to him, assuring him that he wasn't a fool either. The girl turned her face to him again. She sarcastically replied that she still managed to impress her somewhat with her attempts, but the magician still refused such an offer. The Marquis didn't press too hard, so he finally decided to leave the room, but before that, he asked for her hand again. Pharma was somewhat tired of this, but she did not refuse, wanting him to leave sooner. She could not understand why such a banal gesture made her blush, but at that moment the girl paid attention to his eyes, which she would remember forever, the look of a confident person. When the door closed, the girl was still standing in a stupor after everything, until Aeta brought her out of the temporary trance. The witch almost jumped at her friend's voice. The lady inquired about her condition. Milady ran to the assistant, and she pretended as much as possible that everything was fine with her. The lady hastened to apologize for the whole situation in front of her friend, but the girl assured her that everything was fine. But the lady heard their conversation and paid attention to the Marquis's words when he said that they had already met twice. Faret finally realized that she had to talk about the situation in the garden, which she did. Magichka was afraid of this very moment, that her friend would finally understand everything, and for good reason. Aeta was not stupid, so she understood that Ruggiero really liked the assistant. These words even angered her a little. The girl did not want to continue this conversation, and the lady did not calm down and decided to find out her friend's opinion about the appearance of the Marquis, because she had heard beautiful words. But she didn't say anything special. Farm at all costs, because she was almost like a sister to her. All this was only temporary. And with these thoughts, the magician fell asleep, but the dream was abruptly interrupted by someone's voice. The girl suddenly opened her eyes. The voice was familiar, but she could not remember where she had heard it before. She looked out the window, and her face was illuminated by the moonlight. The girl tried to remember the words that the voice told her in her dream. The voice promised to give her everything she wanted, but there was a condition. The sorceress raised her hand, remembering that the condition was not to fall in love. Otherwise, she would instantly lose her magical power, because feelings would overwhelm her mind and then completely replace her abilities. Even in her adult life, She remembered life well when she had no magic. Then, as a very small girl, she lived in the attic surrounded by countless rats. She was holding Ranjo, who was still a baby then. In those days, the girl was never full. She gave everything to her brother so that he did not need anything. It was a miracle they survived. Although she did not remember where she heard this voice in her dream, she could not lose this strength. That is why she made a vow to herself never to fall in love with anyone in order to keep everything as it is. The next morning, in her friend's room, the girl spoke in detail about her dream and the voice she heard in it, in the hope that Aeta would be interested in it and, perhaps, somehow help to learn more about it. And she was not mistaken. The friend immediately replied that she heard the voice of the fairy. The girl continued and told that in ancient stories they often wrote about the blessing or the curse of fairies. They were strange. The fairies themselves were no less strange because they were described as rather capricious creatures, so the reason from which Faret got her power was not known. The girl understood that she needed to wait it out. However, she did not understand how it would be possible to solve the secrets of magic in this way. The lady immediately picked up on it, because the magic itself proved its existence. Records that existed before the era of the church also proved this. As Aeta said, life used to be completely different. Such, which now was not at all similar without magic, even in spite of modern technology. Faret listened to every word, but did not understand the lady at all. Milady came up with something in a moment. She asked her friend what skills she could use, and quickly grabbed her hand and dragged her to the National Academy of Soleil, where she wanted to find answers. Adriano met them. Jeremy, head of the Faculty of Astronomy. The young teacher immediately returned the book she had borrowed to the lady, but he doubted that the foolish students would understand it. Faret did not understand. Milady hastened to explain that such a sharp remark towards the students was due to the fact that they were at odds with the religious faculty. However, the lady noticed that today was rather quiet, to which the manager replied that everyone was now in the conference hall because they said they had received some kind of treasure. Magiczka looked at her friend and immediately understood that a visit to this hall could not be missed. But when they came to the hall, a not very pleasant situation opened up before them. The great minds of the two faculties launched a considerable fight against each other, against the background of different predictions. The girls contemplated. However, in the end, Aeta tired of these unnecessary fights, and she burst inside trying to stop this nonsense, because this place was a beacon of knowledge, not a street circus. But she was not heard. Only after Milady threatened them to tell their father about everything did the men immediately stop the confrontation. The girl asked what kind of treasure they got, and she was shown the blueprints of the project. The girl took the drawings in her hands and began to examine them more carefully. Men's voices sounded in the background. Some wanted to assure the genius of the project, and some were absolutely against it. The men began to praise the project and tried to remember the name of the young scientist who came up with it. One of the professors reminded himself that it was a young man with blonde hair named Elio Rodinati. Hearing this, Faret immediately remembered that the Marquise used that name when he visited her last time. The girls left the academy, and walking along the road, Aeta began to praise Rogero in her voice. She herself considered the project effective, which would help in the construction of the canal. Even in spite of great reluctance, the lady thought that it would be worthwhile to talk about it with the Marquis personally. But something worried. Milady couldn't understand why she had to cover herself with someone else's name, but she didn't really want to think about it now. Magiczka thought about it a little, but could not find an answer. In the end, Aeta was sure that the Marquis had to be forced to talk to his father about this project, because such a talent cannot be lost. The next day, the Duke and the Marquise met. The man began to be interested in what the Marquis would like in exchange for his knowledge. But he was not interested in any positions, which put the Duke in a dead end, because everyone was looking for recognition based on his knowledge. In the end, the boy showed a desire for something and started visiting from afar, telling that he was once very interested in fine arts. As an artist, he wanted to leave something behind. The young man expressed a desire to paint a personal portrait of the Duke's eldest daughter, Lady Aeta. This request was quite strange, so the man did not immediately accept it, but decided to think it over first. After this meeting, the Duke was very angry. His daughter barely managed to calm him down. In her room, she told the sorceress about everything, and she asked why she had come to such a result. Milady exhaled helplessly and explained that the blueprints were only a rough sketch of the project, not the whole thing. In addition, they could not appropriate a person's work without his consent, but there was another reason. The lady said that digging a canal was a dirty job that would lead to the serfdom of the common people. There were rumors that hundreds of people died during the construction of the El Yupo Canal, but this can be avoided with a car. So if they comply with the Marquise's request, they can get a detailed drawing of the model. The assistant saw with what desperation her lady was making this decision, so with a firm will, she decided to help. She herself was summoned to take on this role so that her portrait would be drawn. This statement quite surprised Aeta, because she did not want to create even bigger problems for her friend, but she insisted. Faret reassured the lady and said that nothing terrible would happen even if they were exposed, because the Marquis himself used someone else's name, and this was a much more serious crime because he deceived the whole country. In addition, the magician believed that by such an action she would also be doing a favor for the Marquis, so she became even more enthusiastic about the idea of helping. Milady silently looked at her friend and then gave a big hug and thanked her. Nevertheless, the lady felt sorry for the girl because she had to meet again with a boy who was not even to her taste. This made the girl blush a bit, but she tried to avoid answering. In a moment, she just waved a little, explaining everything by the fact that she agreed to do it for her own sake as well, because if she refused, her loyalty could be questioned by the rest of the servants. But there was something else that she tried not to admit, but every time she lost this confrontation. Even for herself, the girl understood that the Marquis was quite a handsome guy who overshadowed the rest. She looked out the window involuntarily thinking. Meanwhile, Aeta had to inform the Duke of her consent, and it was not worth worrying about her. The main thing for her now is to focus on the task. In a few days, the Salet family finally agreed on an agreement to paint the portrait. From the very morning, the girls began to prepare for the reception. Milady personally decided to put her friend in order. The lady gave her one of her dresses and styled her hair beautifully. After finishing it, she showed it in the mirror, and Faret liked it very much. A friend even joked that the Marquise would fall in love more. Aeta became serious again and asked the magician if she was really sure of her actions, because she would be forced to stay alone with the Marquis. The girl hurried to calm her down, because this was not the first time. The lady tried to bring at least one maid with her friend, but she immediately refused and said that then she would not be able to pretend to be a lady. She finally gave up and said she would be in the next room. She was already in full combat readiness when, after some time, the Marquis entered the room and introduced himself with a fictitious name. It did not make any impression on her, but rather annoyed her a little. The guy took her slight irritation as a joke and, in order to appease the girl, got down on one knee in front of her. Faret was immediately shocked because she did not understand why such a handsome young man did this. However, she didn't want to show it, so she quickly turned away, pretending that she was completely unfazed by it. The Marquise stood up and smiled back. She was capricious on purpose. The girl wanted to start painting the portrait as soon as possible, so the Marquise hurried and the young man did not argue. He sat down in a special place and slowly began his work. Magichka sat as if buried. Within a minute, she felt the back of her neck itch, but she couldn't bring herself to correct the situation while the Marquise was looking at her, so she took advantage of the moment he turned away for a moment. However, she did not have time to do it properly, and the boy still noticed this careless movement, which made him laugh. This annoyed the girl, and she asked the reason for his laughter. The young man apologized. Marquis forgot to inform that at the beginning of work it is not necessary to sit still. The girl was surprised by this, and she said a lot. That it should have been reported earlier, because it was being painted for the first time. Instead, the young man began to shower compliments, but the magician cut him off. Smiling again, he allowed her to relax and read a book or take a nap. Faret finally leaned back in her chair. She took the first book she could get her hands on, and it turned out to be historical. Time passed. Even sitting normally was difficult, so the girl wondered how much time had already passed. Involuntarily, she looked up at the Marquis and finally realized and proved to herself that he was indeed very handsome. The girl met his eyes and asked if everything was okay. It seemed to the boy that he still managed to interest my lady. But she began to avoid the conversation and said that she was only interested in her portrait. The Marquise began to shower compliments again, but it seemed in vain. She began to wonder why the Marquis sought to meet her, if he himself had just confirmed that his skills were not enough to describe her beauty. He replied that he wanted to know more about her. After she asked him a few questions, he also wanted to know something. At that moment, she panicked, because she thought she had made a serious mistake, but the question did not expose her. The girl breathed a sigh of relief, because she thought that the Marquis would ask something strange, but all his questions were only related to the girl's personal predictions, so she easily answered each of them. However, everything she said was Lady Erzeta's favorite, not hers. In a minute, the boy thanked her for the answers. He was pleased to know more about her, but he decided to finish for today. However, unknown even to her, the young man's joy for some reason irritated her, because she could not understand how it was possible to learn more about a person by asking only such questions. Her hands gripped the book tighter. Magichka was also annoyed by the fact that she knew what all this was for, so she was very offended that the Marquis wanted to know more about the lady with such senseless questions, because it was only a small part. She took her will into a fist and said that for the boy this project meant nothing. But for them it was very important, because it could save many lives. So she did not believe a single word he said. Elio didn't answer that. He seemed to feel some guilt, but he didn't show it. The young man quickly began to collect his things, trying to finish the meeting. He said goodbye with his usual actions and left. She looked at him without saying a word. The girl realized that although the Marquis was handsome, rot was spreading inside. Now the magician was personally convinced of this and became sad. The mood did not lift even after she returned to the rooms. Pharma quickly began to take off her clothes, suddenly feeling his heavy weight. Even the soothing words of a friend did not help. The assistant looked at herself in the mirror. There were almost tears in her eyes. The only thing she was really happy about was that her ladyship didn't have to meet this person, and that was very gratifying. A couple of days passed after this meeting. Magichka was helping her mistress to style her hair. The lady, meanwhile, decided to report that she had received information about the Marquis. He recently visited the academy. As it turned out, he explained to everyone the principle of operation of the machine, the drawings for which he created himself. Erzeta did not know the reason for this action, but now they have everything to finish the job. The assistant stopped combing her hair for a moment and thought. She remembered the words she had uttered quite seriously in the last meeting with the Marquis. The girl thought that this was the reason. For a moment, she became very ashamed of her behavior, because she did not want to offend the boy. If his words were true, then that would make her wrong about him and his actions. It got out of hand. Doubts crept into her, because if the young man acted with pure intentions, now she was the one who was deceiving him. The lady's voice pulled her out of her thoughts. The girl did not notice how she continued to do everything on the machine. Saul family had a joint dinner today. Everyone gathered at the same table. Musicians played in the background, creating a special atmosphere around the table. The Duke praised the servants for their fine performance. Saul's sisters took the floor and said that Faret had a wonderful voice. As it turned out, the girl's father was a musician, so she learned this from an early age. The Duchess was interested. Magichka was pleased to hear these compliments, but no one knew that in fact her father was the most ordinary street musician and sometimes performed at banquets or the market, but she did not say it aloud. The youngest of the children said enthusiastically, "Who would like to hear the song performed by her?" And the middle sister immediately picked up on it. She asked the assistant to sing about the traveler Roland. The magician did not really want to sing this particular song because it was about love, but even the Duke himself was interested in it, so he asked to fulfill Weiss's request. There was nowhere to go, so I agreed. Everyone fell silent, and the musicians began to play the desired melody. The girl gathered her strength, and in a moment she began to be beautiful in the hall. The whole family listened to the song with enthusiasm. When she finished, everyone began to praise her for her beautiful and pure voice, and the Duke also thanked her for serving his daughter so faithfully with all her soul and truth. He trusted Pharma. The man said that in order not to happen, now she can turn to Erzeta at any moment and she will help. He will join right away. The girl understood that now she would have an even better life. Even she could see that the song was chosen in any way, but the best. Nevertheless, for some reason, she also admired her. A noble knight who fell in love with an ordinary shepherdess. It reminded her of something. She thought again and again of the marquise, and did not understand why. The girl interrupted these thoughts, because she knew that everything was for the sake of the general plan, so there was no need to delve into it. The next day, Ruggiero visited again to continue painting the portrait. He began to call her, but she was so deep in thought that she did not notice how she was looking at him all the time, and this raised a question. The young man thought that he could do something to anger the girl, but he was wrong. Then he assumed that the lady liked his actions at the academy. She was stunned for a moment, but immediately tried to close the topic. Then the boy assumed that she was looking at him so closely because of sympathy. Of course, these words threw her off track, because he hit the bull's eye, but the girl definitely couldn't confess to him. Because of this, she took a forced step and began to get angry at such an assumption, because it was at least not cultural on his part. The young man wanted to avoid a conflict, because he understood that he had definitely angered her. She just wanted to know the reason. Why did the marquise try so hard? For a moment, her gaze fell on the canvas, namely, the fact that Ruggiero so diligently hid it from her. It seemed strange to her, and he was wary. Magichka understood that they were trying to hide something from her, so she quickly grabbed the picture and began to pull it towards her to see what the matter was. The marquise tried his best not to show the drawing. In the end, she managed to pick up the painting and looked at it carefully. But it was not necessary to look for a long time to understand that the marquis did not know how to draw at all. However, instead of anger, Farme laughed. Such a reaction made the boy go crazy. He tried to explain everything, but the girl did not hear him, because her laughter was loud and spread throughout the room. She could not stop laughing for a long time. When her laughter subsided a little, the magician drew attention to the fact that the young man smeared himself with ink during the hard work. He hurried to cover the dirty spot. She joked about how the marquis saw her when he was painting. He began to make excuses that he had already said before about his skills and that they would not be enough to describe the girl's beauty. But she understood that this was the reason, so she inquired about his intentions. Wiping the dirty parts of his face, the young man finally gave in and said that he just wanted to be with her more, but he was saddened that she and her father finally got what they wanted from him. Faret succumbed to the moment and slowly began to approach him to calm him down. The girl gently touched his face and, on the contrary, supported him. The boy could not take his eyes off her. The sorceress said that the marquis should not stop his training and that in time he would be able to raise his level of drawing, so she returned to the chair so that he would continue drawing. He suddenly remembered a moment in the garden. He recalled that it was when he saw Faret with a lute in his hands that he had an irresistible desire to paint that moment on his canvas. She also remembered this moment, but remained silent. Ruggiero let out a tired breath. Despite all his desire, he wanted to finish his work today. The boy was pleased that despite his clumsy hands, he still managed to cheer her up. His words sounded pleasant to her, but she again pretended to be indifferent. The girl saw that the marquis looked tired, so she let him go without objection. He said goodbye and left. Despite everything, the girl still understood that this time she really liked the meeting. And although she knew that it would not lead to anything, she admitted to herself that she had had a good time. There was an old fairy tale that told about the shepherd Aeta and the water fairy Rebella. Their meeting was fateful. People compared this fairy tale with Faret's parents. My father played the lute and my mother played tambourines. At that time, it seemed to her that the three of them would live forever, in harmony and happily travel around the world. However, at one point everything fell apart, and all dreams of a happy life disappeared in an instant. When their mother died of an unknown illness, music no longer played in their home, and they themselves crossed the threshold of severe poverty. The lute became a way of making money, and traveling took a back seat. And then, the laughter stopped sounding in their house. The days without food dragged on for an eternity, and my father often began to disappear from home and rarely returned. Then he completely disappeared, leaving his daughter alone. In those days, she was very worried, afraid, and worried. Days passed very slowly, and hunger grew stronger. But in the end, the girl stopped waiting for a miracle and had to surrender to fate. Then she decided to go earn money on her own in order to somehow feed herself. People felt very sorry for the little one, because at such an early age, these little hands were already covered with calluses. Everyone around was interested in where her father had gone, But Farme herself decided not to think about it anymore and try to forget everything in order to live on. However, father unexpectedly appeared at home, but not alone. In his hands, the man held a small bundle in which a baby was crying quietly. The girl never doubted the sincerity of her father's feelings for her mother, and her death hit him the hardest. The girl also thought that he was also sincere in the next relationship. But his feelings made no sense, because he could not take care of either of his children, leaving both of them. She drew a parallel with the Marquis, because she also considered him similar to her father. Farme understood that he was with her only because he thought he was with Lady Aeta. But as soon as the truth came out, she would be left. However, the girl was not going to pay attention to this. She had the most important goal, to protect her brother. Besides, she knew and was sure that everything would soon fall into place. But she was not sad. She was even happy. Sitting in the office, Angelo strongly bowed his head. All these promises and affairs have already exhausted the boy. He thought that it was not worth taking on several affairs at the same time. However, not everything was so simple. The young man could not understand why his plan to seduce Lady Sollet did not work, because he did everything for it. Refined movements, pleasant words, nothing worked. She was always ahead. It seemed to him that they were going head to head with her, and there was no change. For a moment, the boy cut himself off, because he understood what he was thinking now about talking to her. Strange sounds were heard from the window. In a moment, he very clearly heard voices and the sounds of some kind of fight. One of the voices was very familiar to him, and the boy immediately got ready to run outside and make sure that the Marquis had come here. In the squash, which was not far from Angelo's office, a considerable quarrel broke out. Rogero wanted to ask for a room for one night, but he had no money with him. He promised that he would bring them tomorrow. However, the hostess of the establishment was adamant and did not want to give in without prepayment. In front of her, she saw an obvious vagabond who met her on every path, but she did not know who was in front of her. Any more persuasions, and the Marquis wanted to try another way, but he did not have time to do anything as he was quickly kicked out of the institution. The guy was left sitting on the street in shock. Even in front of closed doors, he still tried to threaten the establishment, but no one heard him. Angelo came up just in time and shook his hand. The servant asked what he had forgotten in this place. Marquis said that he had nothing to do in the tower, especially when they came up with their plan, so he decided to travel a little. But on the way he came across robbers, so he was left with nothing. Already in the room, the servant told about everything that had happened in the last few days. He also told about the painting, but Rogero was interested in whether there had been any advances with the lady. The guy admitted that everything is difficult. He thought for a moment, because he clearly saw that, like the Marquis, Lady Erzetti did not really want this marriage. In this case, there was nothing stopping him in this place, so he did not understand the desire to stay. However, he replied to the gentleman that, in his opinion, Milady would not refuse the wedding. However, I asked the Marquis why he was so against this marriage, because in any case he would be forced to marry for the title. Having met the gentleman's eyes, he immediately cut himself off, realizing the mistake with this question. Rogero decided to remain silent, sending the servant away. Angelo obeyed and hurried to leave the room. The guy was heading to his office and was stopped by a stranger behind the wall of one of the buildings. The man, wrapped in a robe, asked why the young man had not yet sent the work report. Neither the menacing tone of the interlocutor nor the situation itself scared him. He only replied that they were not the only ones in a hurry, but the lady was not one of the simple ones, so time was needed. He was reminded for the deal. The stranger left, leaving Angelo alone. The boy wiped his glasses, realizing that time was short, so it was necessary to finish all matters with Sola as soon as possible. He reached the office. Summer came. June was outside. Preparations for the Della Festival have just begun. Luce, during which the streets are decorated with various flowers and fruits, bright fabrics and lanterns. In the castle, meanwhile, the women made decorative flowers in their free time. Farme specially made one of these bouquets for her friend. Erzeta accepted the gift, saddened by hers. Magichka only laughed in response and offered to make several bouquets for the lady. The girl asked if her friend would be late, because the time for the festival was approaching. But she promised that she would have time. The girl was glad that she was finally able to deal with her feelings, because this relationship was soon to end. For herself, she decided that there was no point in dressing beautifully. Something practical was better. When Angelo arrived at the castle, he was holding a sealed box in his hands. Magichka inquired what was inside, and the boy opened the gift, which contained a violin. She began to examine the instrument with enthusiasm. The guy said that this thing was made in Valeria. Thanks to the bow, there was no need to touch the strings with your hand. It was difficult for her to believe this. As if enchanted, she lightly touched the instrument with her hand and immediately withdrew her hand. The girl apologized for touching the violin without permission, but did not understand why the Marquis decided to show it to her. He didn't want an apology from her, because now this instrument was hers. The young man admitted that he had bought it at the market and did not even understand how he had brought it to her. It was pleasant, but I wanted to accept it. She directly replied that she had no reason to accept this gift, but the boy insisted, because then this violin would just lie somewhere in an abandoned warehouse, because he himself could not play. The young man saw that the girl was adamant, so he decided to go another way. In a mysterious tone, he offered to give something else. The girl saw this as a trap, because she had nothing to give in return. He assured her that she had misunderstood him and asked only to show her personal library. Magichka was surprised by such a request, but did not see a problem in it. All that was needed was the consent of the lady. She promised to think about this issue, and for now she wanted to return the instrument, but the boy insisted that she keep the violin, because it will be important for him to take it back. It angered her a little. Faret was angry that the Marquis did not ask her consent to keep the instrument. It only made him laugh. The guy offered to continue painting the portrait, but wanted to paint outside this time. The girl agreed, but did not miss the moment to make fun of Ruggiero, because she knew that he did not draw very well, although he behaved like a real artist and this could mislead others. Instead, the guy did not get angry, but on the contrary, supported the conversation and started joking about it. This made Magichka laugh, which cheered him up too. At last, they reached the garden and the young man saw its beauty. She was surprised that the Marquise was so impressed, for the garden of Levanto was no less beautiful, but the boy said that he was paying attention to the contents, not the size. Changing the subject, he asked where he could sit. He did not have time to finish the conversation as he saw that the lady's face turned very pale and he was frightened by it, because he thought that she was sick. However, Faret saw Leah and it scared her a lot, because everything could go wrong. The girl was sent to pick roses for the chef, but it made her a little angry, because she did not have such powers. She was distracted by a sharp sound and turned in that direction, but did not see anyone. Magichka and the Marquis hid behind the bushes and silently waited for Leah to leave. The girl begged her to leave the garden as soon as possible, and the worker eventually left. The lady finally breathed a sigh of relief. The boy's voice woke her up. He asked her to get up from him. The girl did not even notice in which position they ended up. Magichka quickly got up and started apologizing and pouring out explanations. She began to explain that yesterday she had a big fight with her sister, so she didn't want to meet her now. The boy slowly got up, but you could hear in his voice that he was very angry. The girl continued to apologize, but she could not see his face because it was covered by hair. The Marquis never looked at her and turned around to say that he had another meeting, so he left in a hurry. Faret noticed that Ruggiero's neck was red, so she thought that he was very angry. Leaving her alone, the young man did not even take his things, but left them lying on the ground. In a depressed mood, the girl returned to her room. She felt very guilty about that situation. Holding the canvas in her hands, she slowly approached the table to leave the thing there. A violin caught her eye. Magichka carefully touched the strings of the instrument again. I admitted to myself that I was very happy with such a gift. She had not been given what she really wanted for a long time. However, she knew that the Marquis would never find out about it, because for Lady Aeta herself, such gifts were a common thing. She felt ashamed that instead of being grateful, she had spoken rude words. As a sign of gratitude, the girl decided that she would eventually show Ruggiero the library that he had asked for, but it was necessary to ask permission. Meanwhile, the lady herself just visited the city to visit the bookstore. Milady went inside, full of hope. She was met at the counter by a smiling man who told the girl to visit the second floor, because there were new books there. Aeta did not want to lose a moment, so she quickly went up the stairs. Suddenly, she saw the guy and approached him trying to talk, but he only angrily replied that he was already engaged. However, she had no intention of courting him. She just saw a spider on his shirt, so she pointed it out. The young man quickly jumped out of his chair, chasing away the insect, and the spider fell to the ground, running away. But the animal did not have time to escape, because the book that the boy dropped fell directly on it, crushing it. Milady picked up the book and said happily, "That managed to catch her." A spider was pressed on the back. The girl apologized and said a little sadly that she felt sorry for the spider because she thought it was a domestic one. She quickly wiped the back of the cover, which surprised the boy. He immediately said that the girl made him feel ashamed. She immediately apologized for it. It was just a funny situation for her. I understood from his tone that the young man was not local. She didn't want to make the boy blush anymore, so she decided to help him up. He did not accept her hand right away, because he wanted to explain first that he was not a coward, it was just unexpectedness. However, she didn't even think of him as a coward, because she knew that some insects were repulsive. He was surprised to hear this from a girl, because he thought that such a thing was unacceptable for a man. Milady began to assure him that it was not this situation that was humiliating, but that most men were afraid of books, but not him, which made her praise the boy on the contrary, because those she knew avoided reading. These words pleasantly impressed the young man. He could not even say anything. Meanwhile, Aeta took the mutilated book and offered to buy it, because she was largely to blame for this. Milady promised to pay for the book, leaving him a handkerchief to wrap the book in if he was uncomfortable holding it because of the spider situation. She hurried to leave the bookstore. He returned home in complete confusion. When he entered the room, Angelo already met him and saw that the gentleman was somewhat confused, so he began to ask if everything was okay with him. Ruggiero himself could neither explain nor tell anything. He only handed the servant a shawl and ordered to wash it. The boy took the book with him and went to his room. A lot of thoughts were spinning in my head. The image of the girl did not leave his head. He wanted to know who she was and where she came from. Lying on the bed, he kept trying to make sense of the feelings that were unfamiliar to him before. After returning home, Milady met with a disgruntled farme. The girl scolded the lady for going outside alone. It didn't matter that she loved books, but it was dangerous. Aeta only laughed, but it offended the magician. However, the lady did not laugh at her, but only remembered today's situation. In a moment, the girls were distracted by the violin, which the Marquise had given the assistant. Milady saw that her friend liked the gift very much, so she allowed him to keep it, which made her very happy. The girl also drew attention that the Marquis gave a thing that Farme really liked. The magician told exactly what the Marquise wanted in return for the gift, so Milady, after thinking about it, allowed Ruggiero to show her library, because she believed that he would definitely be good with books. Aeta wanted to pay tribute to the Marquis, because her friend became happier with him. Magichka, of course, was glad that the lady allowed to show the library, but it had its consequences. Because the young man was a book lover. The young man carefully searched for something. Due to his height, he had to bend down a lot to reach the lower shelves, but the girl even thought it was very cute, because she saw how he tried. She also drew her attention to the fact that the Marquis handled the books very carefully. He behaved in a completely different way when he painted. It seemed to her that this is how a person behaved with a valuable thing. Looking at the boy, she plunged into her thoughts again. Angelo began to call her, but the girl did not immediately regain consciousness, so he thought that something had happened to her again. Magichka asked to be very careful with the book he was holding in his hands, because it was a very valuable manuscript, which was more than 300 years old, and the golden frame was handmade. He promised that he would be very careful with this book, but he noticed that the girl was discussing her books with him, while earlier she noted that she was sharing it with people very close to her. Magichka began to explain that she only wanted to share her thoughts, because he already knew so much about many things, because he was very well read. She reminded him of the criticism of one article in which the Marquise had participated. Angelo was startled by such a statement, because he did not know about it, although now he had to pretend. He tried to explain the situation, find words, but the girl was no longer listening. She just went to the window and opened it wide. Resting her hands on the windowsill, she silently began to look into the distance. This surprised the Marquise, because the girl continued to stand silently. The wind began to come inside, but it seemed to be controlled by something. After some time, Farmi returned to the boy and openly asked him if he still did not believe in magic. He was at a loss for words.